For this kind introduction. I congratulate you to have chosen such a complex topic like trade agreements, and even more having it placed just after lunch, so I can promise you you will sleep extremely well with this topic. What I've done with this and why I agreed very happily to present this topic is I worked at the World Health Organization around 5 to 6 years on this topic and on other trade-related topics at WTO level like GATS, TRIPS, SPS, and TBT. So let's start with TTIP and healthcare services. The thing is that unfortunately, to understand it properly, we have to go a little bit back, about 20 years, to the General Agreement on Trade and Services from WTO level, because this is the mother of all services-related trade agreements. It entered into force 1st of January 1995. It was the first multilateral agreement on international trade in services. It was negotiated by governments, and the objectives were simplification of trade and services, reduction of trade barriers, promoting further liberalization of trade and services. Something you have to understand if you talk about trade agreements is what are the modes of supply of services. So how do you supply a service? And according to the GATS schedule, or the idea behind the GATS, you have 4 modes of services supply. Mode 1 is cross-border supply, so a supplier and consumer are in different countries. This is, for example, e-health, telemedicine, teleeducation as well. It was a little bit a question if it's health insurance, but we come to this later. Mode 2 is consumption abroad, easier. So it is about medical, dental care, promotion of healthcare and prevention, and so on and so forth. Something that a person consumes abroad. The third mode of supply is very interesting. It is commercial presence abroad. Or this is something like foreign direct investments, stakeholding, subsidiaries abroad, like in the hospital area, health management, and also health insurance. And the fourth mode, also quite known to us, is migration of healthcare professionals. So this can happen in any part of the health system. These 4 modes you have to learn, unfortunately, you have to understand, because the whole structure of trade agreements are based on these 4 modes of services supply. So what is the scope of the GATS? It's said in Article 1.3 that services include any service in any sector except for services supplied in the exercise of government authority. And this is any service which is supplied neither on a commercial basis nor in competition with other or more services suppliers. So now we can say, what about health services? Isn't a health service supplied in the exercise of a governmental authority? I say yes, maybe, because it's not. Sometimes it's not in competition, but in most countries it is in competition. So although a health service might be supplied in the exercise of a governmental authority, the rule number 2 is not always fulfilled, that it is not supplied in competition. So this sometimes gives, if you go to court, it gives you some problems. And then you have the same thing in the Annex on Financial Services. So for the purpose of this agreement, services supplied in the exercise of government authority means the following: activities forming part of a statutory system of social security or public retirement plans. Why is it so important that I repeat it here? And why is it here financial services? The reason is that although for us, we are coming from the health sector, we would say, okay, a health insurance is an original part of our health system, so this is health. For the systematic of a trade agreement, it's not. A health insurance is a financial service. So if you look in the schedule of the GATS or a trade agreement, you have to look at totally different place to find some information about health insurance. Very important to remember. So what is the structure of the GATS? So every member state of the WTO is obliged to respect all general obligations, and regarding the specific commitments, member states do or do not commit to these on a voluntary basis during negotiations. What this means, we come to this now. What are general obligations? The first general obligation in a trade agreement is non-discrimination. You are not allowed to discriminate. Here you have something which is called the most favored nation status, or in the GATS most favored nation treatment clause, Article 2, and it means that a certain favor accorded to one WTO member has to be accorded to all WTO members as well. So every time a country decreases or increases trade barriers, it has to do so for all WTO members. There are in the GATS some health exceptions. In the GATS it's in Article 14. And this Article 14 authorizes member states to take measures to restrict services and service suppliers for the protection of human, animal, and plant life of health. So members have the right to determine the level of health protection they deem appropriate. For a lot of us, this seems to be quite known because we have something similar in the European Treaty. And human health has been recognized by WTO as being an important in the highest degree, and this was in the famous asbestos cases that we will not touch now. So, in principle, the Article 14 measures have an overriding effect over other obligations. And the relevance of these measures have to be proven. So you just can't say, well, because it's health, I want to adopt it, but you have to prove it, that it is really overriding, that it's really the measures you're taking are on the focus with health, and that they really, this is the second, the health measures are required to be no more trade restrictive than necessary, so the measure you want to take shall not restrict trade anymore, then it is absolutely needed to achieve this health goal you want to achieve. Unfortunately, no more trade restrictive than necessary is not defined. So whenever there is a dispute over this, you find yourself at court, and then they have to decide whether your measure that you have adopted is more trade restrictive as necessary or not. So, these were in principle, in a very short form, general obligations. Now we come, and now we increase the complexity a little bit, we come to specific commitments. What is it? So, as I said before, every member state is free to make or not specific commitments. And if a member state makes specific commitments, these take effect towards all other WTO member states. So, no discrimination. And this is independent, in principle, from the fact whether or not another member state has also made a specific commitment in this area. So, these specific commitments are not reciproc. So, it's a limited reciprocity. Very important to realize. So something you give to another one, if I give Dimitrios an apple, Dimitrios is not required to give an apple back to me. He can give me a peach. Well, normally I will require him to give me something back, but it doesn't necessarily have to be an apple. So member states may decide on the quantity, which is the sectors, as well as on the quality of their commitments. So how deep they want to commit. So they want no commitment, a partial commitment, or full commitment. And to make it a little bit more complicated so that you don't fall asleep so easily, the specific commitments can be on two levels. You can have horizontal commitments, which apply to all sectors that are mentioned in the negotiation roadmap, or they can be made sector specific. So they do only apply to one specific of the 12 in the GATS services sectors or subsectors. Here, this is quite interesting. I have just listed, without a guarantee that this is exhaustive, some sectors that are health related. So first sector is called health services of nurses and midwives, and then we have something which is in principle said supply of pharmaceutical goods to the general public by pharmacists. And this is a little bit, you have to search for it. It is under business services and then professional services, and then the last one without any letter, this is the supply of pharmaceutical goods to the general public. Other service sectors are hospital services or other medical services, and then number 5, you have this insurance and life, insurance and life and health, which is totally somewhere different, which is in section 7 under financial services. In TTIP, this interesting thing which I have highlighted here, it sounds a little bit different. It has a letter K, but in principle it's the same. Here in TTIP it says retail sales of pharmaceuticals and retail sales of medical and orthopedical goods, which is all subsumed under one letter. So, to make it a little bit more complicated, these specific commitments can be made in 2 areas, in market access and in national treatment. So how do you treat national service providers or foreign service providers? What does it mean? Well, first let's see how a schedule of commitments looks like. So here, at the top, you have an example for a sector, and then here you have the 4 modes, and then you have the 2 areas in market access and national treatment, and then you have some examples how these commitments can be in unbound, partial commitment, or full commitment. So if you do it for all the possibilities you have, you will find out that you have quite a lot. I've shown you the sectors that have a relation to health. All the sectors have also subsectors, and then you have in each of the subsector you have 4 modes, 2 sorts of trade restrictions, and different sorts of equality, how deep or not deep you can make your commitment. So it is a huge variety, and all of this you have to understand, ideally, before you make any commitment. So what is market access? In the Article 16 of GATS, it is a little bit explained. Market access, or Article 16, recalls the most favored nation treatment of Article 2, and market access limits the measures which can be adopted or maintained by a member state if they undertake market access commitments. And to regulate the market access of services, capital, well, it's used to regulate the market access of services, capital, natural persons, and legal entities. This is, in principle, what I said before, the 4 modes. Now it's getting really interesting, because here I said limits the measures which can be adopted or maintained by member states for what? For example, for steering a health system. So what are these measures that you can restrict? And here there is the example of the measures according to the WTO GATS. The first is the limitation of the numbers of service suppliers. The second is the limitation of the total value of service transactions or assets. And the third is the limitations of the total number of service operations. It goes further. Then the next is limitation of the total number of natural persons that can provide the service in your country, natural persons from another country, and specific types of legal entity of joint ventures that you allow to perform a certain service. This, for example, is a German example where only a pharmacist can run a pharmacy. And F is limitations on the participation of foreign capital. If you had a little bit more time, and I did this little exercise with my students, I asked them, think of these 6 limitations or the 6 measures, and think which measures are used in your country in the health system to steer a health system. The only correct answer is all. So whenever you do a trade agreement, which means in principle that you give away some of these 6 tools, you limit the possibility of regulating your health system by giving away one of these 6 tools, either fully, partly, or if you're very clever, not at all. Very important to understand. And national treatment in comparison is relatively easy, which means any discrimination of foreign service suppliers in favor of the national service supplier is forbidden, unless this has been specified in a list of commitments and it has been agreed. So, again, here you have the schedule of commitments. Maybe now, at least, you don't understand it, but you get a little bit more a flavor of how complicated a schedule of a trade agreement is, and how deep you have to understand, ideally before you conclude such a trade agreement, what the agreement and what the agreement means for your health system and the steering of your health system. Just a little bit more on GATS. GATS was a dynamic process. I think now it is not a dynamic process anymore. So it contained a roadmap for a new round of negotiations. This started in 2000 in 2000. Sorry, here's a mistake. It was 5 years after the entry into force of the GATS. There was no fixed date for the end of negotiations, and for now there is no end of these negotiations in sight. So now we translate all this into TTIP. Why? Because TTIP is based on the same principles as in the GATS. So the principle, the schedule, everything is the same. So this is the reason why I started with the GATS, because it's absolutely the same. So what is now TTIP, the Transatlantic Trade and Investment Partnership? So it's a bilateral trade and investment agreement, not multilateral like the GATS, between the EU and the US. And the EU Commission negotiates on behalf of the EU, and this mandate is based, or this negotiation is based on a mandate received from the European Council. And the Council and the European Parliament have to approve the outcome of the negotiations. Presently, it's not totally clear, and it's under dispute, if also the member states' parliaments have a say and have a right of participate in this approval of the outcome of the TTIP. And it is said that the same approach as in previous trade agreements shall be used. This is why we looked at GATS. The talks started in June 2013, and now, up to now, we had 10 rounds of negotiations. Why is this so important? So why are we negotiating about a trade agreement with the US? In 2013, the main partner for EU 28 exports of services was the US. And the US also is the main partner for the imports and also for services. And yet, according to the European Commission, there still remain great opportunities to expand trade and services sector. And the European Commission says that professional and business services are among the sectors that accelerate the integration in global value chains. That's what they say. And they also say that the EU proposal on services does not influence financial services. And plus, they will also, what we see later, they will also say that it will not influence health systems. So what are the three main pillars of TTIP? TTIP consists of three parts. And these three parts, well, the first is now very common to you because we've discussed it, market access. And the question is, will this affect health services? The second part is regulatory cooperation in various sectors, among which pharmaceutical services and medical services was explicitly mentioned. And the third part of TTIP are rules like dispute settlement, intellectual property right, and competition policy. What are the pros and cons of TTIP? So the objectives of the Commission are to opening the US market to EU firms, helping reduce bureaucratic burdens that firms can face when exporting, and setting new rules to make it easier and fairer to export and import and invest overseas. And the intended goals, so the presumed advantages are to generate jobs and growth in the EU, to cut prices and offer more choice for consumers, and more business opportunities for European businesses, including SMEs, small and medium-sized enterprises. And pharmacies normally are small and medium-sized enterprises. They are even more, they are smallest enterprises, which is below 10 people of staff. The problem is that these are presumptions by the European Commission, and there is unfortunately no valid evidence-based proof that this in the end will be true. Very, very short, and I will not go through the whole thing. I would like to introduce you into the 10 rounds of negotiations on TTIP. In the first round, they talked about services, investment protection, small and medium-sized enterprises. They talked about pharmaceuticals, harmonization of standards. In the second round, they talked about services and investment. I only refer here now to the most important topics. In the third round, interesting topic was goods trade. In the fourth round, the topics were market access, regulatory issues, so achieving greater regulatory compatibility without compromising the existing levels of protection in the respective legislation. But the sectors they discussed about included medical devices and pharmaceuticals, and they talked about trade rules in general. In the fifth round, they talked about investor-state dispute settlement and technical barriers to trade, which is translated into normal English, norms and standards. In the seventh round, they talked again about market access, services and investment, pharmaceutical and medical devices. In the eighth round, they talked about services in general. In the ninth round, they talked again about pharmaceuticals and medical devices. We're not going to detail here. I just want to highlight the topics. And in the 10th round, they talked about services. EU proposal includes placeholder on investment protection because they suspended it a little bit because they said, we have so many criticism in the EU, so we are not going to talk and to negotiate about it. They talked about pharmaceuticals, progress on respective good manufacturing practice systems, also very important. Again, they talked about medical devices. And the Commission says that they would ensure that the products imported to the EU meet our high standards regarding people's health and safety, and that the EU governments fully maintain their right to adopt rules and laws to protect people, and member states will maintain the right to regulate and run public services, including health services. And they also say that public health systems are not within the scope of negotiations. But only few and general information on the content of negotiations is public. And also, but, if we look at the negotiation rounds, they are talking about health topics. And we don't know exactly in which depths and about what. So, of course, there is some suspicion that although they say everything is fine, relax, don't worry, there is some concern, maybe from a lot of sides, that never trust them. The EU Commission keeps assuring that TTIP won't affect governments' ability to decide on how to run publicly funded health systems. But the definition of what falls under the definition on public funded health systems or public services is not clear. So, for example, pharmacy service is not, is it publicly funded or is it private? The other problem is we know the EU offers since, when was it, a couple of weeks ago, but we do not know the US requests. And what we even less know is the results of this so-called request and offer process, because first there come the requests and then there come the offers. Normally the requests are secret, the offers are public. So the European Parliament also requests to stick to the negotiators' clear commitment to exclude current and future services of general interest. Services of general interest, as these are, well, as I said, as well as services of general economic interest from the scope of application of TTIP. This would include health and social security services or systems. And the European Parliament also requests to ensure that national and, if applicable, local authorities retain the full right to introduce, adopt, maintain, or repeal any measures with regard to the commissioning, organization, funding, and provision of public services as provided in the treaty. This would include, in principle, health services. So it seems that the European Parliament is on our side. But as it is always, you have different parts, you have different levels, you have the health group and you have the economic group, and you can be quite sure that there are also different interests in the different groups. So how can we exclude health systems out of TTIP? So there are in principle two ways to do this. The first way is a positive list. So each country specifies the kind of services it will open for foreign suppliers. So it can restrict to the kinds of services a country really wants to open. And if they don't write down health services, then health services are not opened. A negative list is the other way, and the EU states say they will open up all services to foreign providers except to certain services listed in an annex of the agreement, but then the problem is upcoming new services will automatically be open to foreign suppliers, as they cannot figure into the list of exceptions because you have done them further. So which approach would be used is still not known. So which approach, a positive list or negative list, they will use in the TTIP is still not known. There are two other buzzwords you will come across if you talk about trade agreements and also TTIP. And the buzzwords are standstill and ratchet clause. And we think that we should neither have the ratchet clause or a standstill clause for health services. What does it mean? A standstill clause is that members would agree not to create new obstacles to services trade. And a ratchet clause is, well, who's a mechanical person knows what a ratchet is. Privatization cannot be revised, so no new regulation or re-regulation is possible. For example, Hungary, think of it, because you're re-regulating, Attila. So what we think is that member states must maintain the possibility to revise decisions if it turned out that the original decision was not ideal, or implement new regulations, when they consider it to be necessary or in order to guarantee a high level of services or services security or health security. So to finish, what are our claims? So our claims are we need quality of and quick access to treatment as well as high level of patient safety, and this must not be compromised by a trade agreement. And second thing is the responsibility for the organization and steering of health systems must stay within the individual member state, as it said and is stipulated in Article 168 of the treaty. And maybe for this we need a positive list in TTIP which ensures that TTIP does not apply to health care services or healthcare professionals. Third point, healthcare services are sensitive and of general interest, so they cannot be compared with market-oriented services. Fourth point, patient rights and the liberal aspects of practice of healthcare professionals must not be restricted or removed. The fifth point, no influence for capital interests, not even indirectly, on health-related decisions. 6 points, avoid rationalization of healthcare. 7th point, present requirements for entering and practicing a healthcare professions, ensure patient safety and a high-quality provision of healthcare. And this must not be undermined by free trade agreements. 8th point, no forced deregulation. Regulation safeguards the high standards of healthcare, no forced deregulation. So this could be if a company via the investor-state dispute settlement deems that it is unfairly treated, and it says, well, you have to deregulate because I'm unfairly treated. And the 9th and last point, no standard setting, also very important. Healthcare professionals must be able to decide on a case-by-case basis on what is the best treatment. So healthcare is nothing which can be standardized, and therefore we think that standards and norms should not be introduced in healthcare. So this was my short version of a normally 4-hour presentation and seminar I've given at the university. Thank you very much for your kind patience.